Before watching this video, I recommend playing Spider-Man for the PlayStation 4 if you want to avoid any and all spoilers. I won't be covering much, if any, details of the DLC, as I imagine the base game is what most players will experience. While I'm not an avid comic book reader, I have experienced, or at least been aware of to a casual extent, the multitude of cartoon shows, films, and video games that have featured Spider-Man for as long as I can recall. While I'm not going to pretend that I know as much about Spider-Man and Marvel to the same degree as someone who might read the comics, I entered into the PS4 exclusive game as a fan, following its release closely and excited to get my hands on it. Spider-Man as a character has been adapted to endless formats in media over the last 50 years, including video games, so it's only natural that some comparisons are going to be made. One point of comparison that myself and maybe many fans might have is the Spider-Man 2 video game released in 2004. It's famous for being the first Spider-Man game that prioritized realistic web swinging. Webs could attach to buildings and your trajectory would be dictated by how fast you were moving and where your webs would attach. These were pretty bold choices on behalf of Treyarch and its programmers at the time. The amount of resources that would require making this work on a technical and gameplay level would potentially be enormous compared to other games based on licensed properties. Even if those mechanics weren't perfect, it was at least memorable. So you can imagine what it might take to get something that may seem relatively small to work in a game even with the most bloated budget. This kind of ambition is echoed in Spider-Man for the PS4. As first impressions go, the overall polish and presentation of Spider-Man PS4 is masterful. The opening cinematic tells you everything you need to know about Peter Parker's life without being overly long. In fact, it's done mostly visually, which demonstrates some great restraint on the developer's behalf. The game can't get you out web swinging fast enough, and like the Spider-Man 2 game, the webs do attach to the buildings. One thing that stood out to me is that the game pauses the action to tell the player which button to push to keep swinging. While I'm someone who prefers to experiment with control systems, the necessity to do this is not lost on me because I can imagine how immersion breaking it might be if the first thing that the player does with Spider-Man is fall flat on their face. So through this tutorial, the game communicates very quickly its first priority. Swinging is integral to the overall experience. In other media, there's always a sense of grace and thrill when Spider-Man moves. Insomniac went into great detail as far as this is concerned. The amount of animations, effects, and tools that they put behind traversal to simulate the freedom of being Spider-Man is impressive to say the least, but with extra emphasis on simulated. Physics are not realistic by a long shot. If you swing too low, for example, the trough of your swing flattens out, so the player doesn't collide with traffic. The game also allows you to move through minor obstructions, such as tree branches. It also seems that your highest speeds are throttled to a certain degree. Having it accurate to real-world physics presents unique challenges. Going too fast might present issues when navigating tightly spaced areas, for example. Misjudging your distance from the ground could lead to an abrupt end to your momentum. Tree branches that slow you down could affect the urgency of a mission. I can imagine Insomniac really had to soul search about how accurate the physics should be. You have to find the right balance, but I believe the choice to smudge the physics to suit the needs of the game is the right one. I can't really avoid saying it, but in order for the game to let you feel like Spider-Man, swinging absolutely needs to feel graceful and consistent. While these concessions help to make Spider-Man look and feel graceful, swinging is simply treated as the means of travel in Spider-Man, punctuated by small flourishes here and there. The thrill of traversal is lacking. Making it impossible for injury or death in a freefall almost seems like a mistake. Furthermore, the visual impact is weak as well. This is something I could forgive if it even looked like he was making a dent in the pavement. There's not a lot of content in the open city to provide unique challenges for traversal either. Taskmaster missions and the pigeon rescue missions are where your speed and accuracy are challenged, but there's far too few of them to be considered a main draw. There was a lot of potential with the inclusion of mid-air tricks, but that aspect is also very limited. You can't have a superhero without heroism, and that's where the combat comes in. As the combat stands, it's probably the most unrefined aspect of the game, and you do a lot of it. Encounters mostly come down to managing your focus, suit power cooldowns, and gadgets to take enemies down. Achieving a high combo count and pulling off certain moves will boost your focus meter faster, allowing you to execute finishers and reuse your gadgets. While this kind of combat loop makes sense for a character like Spider-Man, I can only describe the execution of its combat systems as frustrating. The combat system tries to achieve a similar gracefulness that traversal achieves. In the execution of this, however, it seems like the game is torn between a couple objectives. Building combos and Spidey's varied attack animations suggest that it wants to be something akin to Bayonetta or Devil May Cry, but those games usually have fewer enemy types per area, even if the gameplay seems stylish and fast. This game has a tendency to throw a ton at you at once with no real rhyme or reason. Furthermore, with the enemy placement as it is, the flow of combat is halted to a screech when you aren't sure where you're being shot from, or the last enemy is hiding behind cars, or on the other side of an area completely. An enemy is highlighted to indicate who you'll be attacking, but in order to do this you have to point Spider-Man's body at them. This system is so sensitive you might find yourself attacking an enemy you don't necessarily intend on, leaving you exposed. Enemies have wind-up animations that allow you to anticipate attacks. With the sheer amount of enemies though, they often occur simultaneously and step over each other. It isn't too clear on what Spider-Sense prioritizes, so it's entirely possible to dodge into other enemies already engaged in attacks. There are of course various gadgets, suit powers, and other upgrades that are intended to aid in combat. While the game is balanced in such a way that you can unlock everything in a single run of the game on any difficulty, many tools accomplish some goals better than others. For example, one of the first suit powers you obtain is the Web Blossom, an effective crowd control tool. Encounters such as crimes and bases lean heavily on crowding, which pretty much make any other powers a lower priority. It's also more or less guaranteed this move will restore your focus meter instantly to pull off more finishers. It makes sense to unlock some of the more powerful stuff later on. Gadgets like the suspension matrix will make any encounter a breeze. But in order to get these upgrades, you must have already completed most of the game already, negating any real reason to use them in the first place.
That's it?
The artificial intelligence for allies and enemies both leaves something to be desired. Goons even shoot their own comrades. There's a huge disconnect when you can actually see bullets hitting the bad guys, which have zero effect on them, but can destroy you. The bullets from police allies might interrupt attack animations, but they appear to do little to nothing to subdue enemies. It's pretty pathetic to know that even though the good folks of the NYPD appear to aid you, they aren't programmed to do so. If we keep in mind that Spider-Man's deft elegance in the face of mortal danger is part of his appeal, fewer enemies in an area with more predictable attacks might benefit the gameplay, but going too far in this direction might betray the character. Perhaps better targeting or visual indicators of when threats are imminent would also help. This is already possible with missile launchers, for example. It's hard to say what a real solution is, but having almost every combat encounter boil down to the same abilities being used over and over seems to betray the character as well. The animation department put a lot of work into the fluidity of combat, and more skilled players can pull off some sick moves, but skill and strategy seem like afterthoughts. For example, in a Fisk or Demon base, the mission starts you off in stealth, but this is mostly for show. While this indicates that you should begin the fight at your own pace, taking out most enemies in the first wave won't make the later waves any different than if you decided to go in swinging. The only incentive then is the possibility of earning more base tokens for unlocking gear, which are already abundant enough through accomplishing other tasks. This makes any return to these bases for any other reason into an exercise in tedium, as every wave has an abundance of enemies and you enter the crowding issues again.
This is like when the band's doing its fourth encore and you just kinda wanna go home.
There's no real sense of urgency when it comes to random encounters in the city, or going from one story mission to another. You're free to do as much, or as little as possible, and it bears no impact on the story how much crime you've prevented. The game changes pace at times to include moments with Mary Jane and Miles Morales and more limited stealth segments. They often serve to introduce a new area or explore the story from another perspective, such as when Peter is incapacitated during the City Hall attack. While changing the pace in this way might give players a break from the constant action, there seems to be few stakes to these. They obviously wouldn't have the tools to defend themselves like Spider-Man, but getting caught doesn't result in anything but lost time. Take the City Hall attack again. If Miles gets caught by a demon, it ends in a game over, as he's apparently killed. However, when he reaches the objective, he's caught by demons anyway. The only difference is that Mr. Negative happens to be nearby and gives the order to ignore him for some reason. What narrative information could be achieved in these gameplay segments could be achieved just as well through an extended cutscene. There is a Mary Jane mission where she has to coordinate with Spider-Man to take out enemies. This segment stands out as gameplay is interwoven in such a way to complement what the story had led up to, a moment where Mary Jane and Peter find out a way to work together to get the upper hand on the demons. In terms of general cohesion with gameplay and story, this is probably the best example in the game, but also the only example where this is attempted. All in all, it felt like none of the individual gameplay elements appeared to really gel with one another. It's as if separate teams were working on different parts at the same time, and then at the end they had to mash them all together to make one whole game.
Nice. Okay, what next?
Even the most casual fan would agree that one of the most overt tropes of Spider-Man stories are his relationship to the villains. More often than not, he has a personal connection to them, rather than having a simple adversarial dynamic. He not only fights to stop whatever diabolical plan they come up with as Spider-Man, but as Peter Parker, his underlying struggle is to maintain the connections he values the most. Of course, this is consistent in the story of Spider-Man for PS4. In fact, it's probably what makes this story rival even some of the strongest Spider-Man stories before it. One of the marketing phrases for the game was "be greater," and that's probably the most accurate way to describe Peter's super objective in the story. Octavius and Lee are what Peter seemingly aspires to be. They are selfless, aiming to help humanity in more permanent and substantial ways. It makes sense that Peter is drawn to Otto, as they're both analytical and scientifically proficient. Martin Lee has that extra layer of humility and sacrifice that parallels Peter's experience as Spider-Man. Peter's eventual discovery that Lee is Mr. Negative was an especially trenchant moment that showcases the height of storytelling in the game. In the aftermath of the City Hall attack, Peter investigates Lee's office at Feast and discovers clues about Devil's Breath. As he's leaving, Lee is standing right there as if he was waiting for Peter. This scene is one of my favorites as it showcases every part of the game's central conflict while moving the plot forward. Even if Lee's presence seems convenient, we learn something about Lee and Peter at the same time. This wouldn't be achieved without an all-around stellar performance from everyone involved. There's competence, and then there's craft. It takes a certain level of craftsmanship in the performance that can only be achieved by a complete understanding of the characters. And the cast of Spider-Man do this in spades. Current and former casting aside, I would be hard-pressed to imagine anyone but Yuri Lowenthal as Spider-Man. Lowenthal manages to keep his performance consistent, affable, full of emotional intent, and somehow not obnoxious despite how often we hear his voice.
Who are you?
I'm your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man.
Smart ass.
Thankfully, the writing gives him a lot to work with. I can't recall many instances where I heard the same one-liner more than once.
Aw, you can't fool me, Mr. Gruff Exterior. I know you love me, and I love you back.
The direction to include extra line readings for specific situations is an extra layer of polish that gives many other high-budget games a run for their money.
But one of the guards just walked up to his cell and released him, then gave him his suit back.
I knew Shocker was working for someone. What did you get out of the guard?
Then gave him his suit back.
I knew Shocker was working for someone. What did you get out of the guard?
When the game takes a show and don't tell approach, it's often when the narrative moments shine. The scenes that avoid dialogue altogether are just as compelling. Another strength is in the way the game establishes its tone and the status quo. To believe Kingpin can still get away with this level of destruction is a bit absurd.
Mind if I join in on the fun?
You know how his lawyers are. This one needs to go by the book.
But it serves to illustrate what kind of world this version of Spider-Man lives in. It has a sort of camp value that I can appreciate. It makes for good visuals and seemingly high stakes, and it provides an excuse for the bad guys to have a wide variety of tools to take the player out. That being said, there are moments where subtlety and clarity get lost in the shuffle. There is one scene in particular, though, that loses me the more and more I think about it.
Such a disappointment. Parker. You knew? I tried to warn you, Peter, but you didn't listen. You knew.
This is probably the dumbest and most inconsistent character moment because it paints Peter as a complete moron. One of the earliest scenes has Otto discover working on a spider suit. Even the lie of being Spider-Man's tailor seems pretty thin, and would still make Peter close enough to Spider-Man to put him in danger.
Yes. I guess if you design his equipment, you're bound to be a target too.
Compare this with being Spider-Man's photographer. Being his photographer grants Peter enough distance from Spider-Man to make that relationship work without putting them in the same place too often. Not only that, Otto's base of operations is the same as Peter's. It's only obvious that Otto would eventually see right through it.
I noticed you keep track of Spider-Man's foes. Smart. Easier to craft countermeasures that way.
It would have been a better choice to me at least to chalk up to being Spider-Man. It would explain more clearly to Otto about his constant lateness, but bringing Otto into his inner circle would allow Peter to more intrinsically trust Otto. In theory, this would make Otto's betrayal that much more heartbreaking. It makes the same moment on top of Oscorp a little more poignant as Spider-Man remembers where his loyalty lies, and why he began as a superhero in the first place. I might have misread that scene, but Peter did seem pretty convinced that it worked.
Your secret's safe.
Regardless if you believe one form of media is superior to another, each type of presentation has their own advantages and pitfalls. An original play, for example, might have its only production tied to a specific theater and wouldn't necessarily be accessible to the bulk of people who might be interested in seeing it. The film adaptation might be seen by more people, but might have taken some creative liberties. such as an all-new cast or settings which weren't explicit in the source. What priorities a particular work has is the prerogative of the ones creating it, and Spider-Man for the PS4 is, for all intents and purposes, another kind of adaptation. Not only does it need to do the character justice, it also must succeed as a video game. Video games are unique in their ability to allow the player to interact with an environment similar to the way an actor might interact with the props and sets of a stage. While a game screen can be used in similar ways to movies, this is game's ultimate advantage. Spider-Man for PS4 desires to have it both ways. A linear, immersive narrative experience, but also an open world for exploration, with the motivation to approach scenarios in different ways. While there's some room for experimentation, this doesn't apply to the whole of experiences in the gameplay. I can't imagine replaying the game to improve my skill in its combat, while also being engaged with the story. The story parts can exist on their own without needing to experience the rest of the game. Boss fights, for example, already require few, if any, necessary upgrades. The only thing that really bridges the narrative moments is the traversal. Take that out and you have a movie. I'm not totally condemning this game, as Marvel's Spider-Man is not a bad game by any means, and I enjoyed it more than I didn't enjoy it. In New Game Plus, I even found myself role-playing to a certain degree, switching to a specific suit given what situation called for it. So the amount of care and detail that Insomniac put into the game is not lost on me. Given the circumstances, this might be the best Spider-Man game that they could have possibly made. On the other side of this though, Spider-Man takes too few risks to make it interesting beyond its narrative. The only thing I can hope for is that the eventual sequel will be greater than this one.
Ugh!